Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. Ready for a shocker? Or maybe not. The average Chicago motorist spent 102 hours in traffic last year. Wow. Chicago and New York City are actually tied for some of the worst traffic in the world, and both need more revenue. Well, on Sunday, New York launched a potential solution to those problems, what is known as congestion pricing. Motorists who drive into Manhattan below 60th Street are now charged $9. A few years back, former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot floated a similar idea. And then this week, Mayor Brandon Johnson followed suit. So could some version of New York's program help with traffic and budget woes here? What could that look like? And what are some possible pros and cons? Here to discuss is Joe Schwieterman, director of the Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development at DePaul University. Good to see you again, Joe.
Thank you.
Justin Marlowe is a research professor in the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Welcome back, Justin.
Hey, Sasha.
And Audrey Wennink is the director of transportation with the Metropolitan Planning Council. Good to see you, Audrey.
Hello.
So New York City's congestion pricing program, it started earlier this week. Drivers are going to be charged, as I said, a whopping $9 when they enter Manhattan during peak hours. This is weekdays starting at 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., so basically all day. I mean, what do you think about the city's move? Audrey, you first.
Yeah, well, I think we are in a transit funding crisis right now. And so we're thinking about that linked to how can we solve some of our transit funding problems. So MPC is actually thinking about this at a regional level, and potentially there could be a congestion pricing solution at a more regional level that could solve the transit funding problem at a regional level. So we think there's viability, but maybe not for the city alone, because that's too small of an area, and we're different than New York.
What do you think, Joe?
You know, everybody's watching this. It's fascinating how this has been rolled out with, I think, a revised and maybe more reasonable fee, the $9 rate. Intercity buses are exempt. There's discounts for midnight travel. You don't pay as much at 3 in the morning. And the lessons around the world are pretty favorable. I mean, Singapore and London have done this with a lot of effect. We are a giant global city, so I do think it has to be part of the mix. But as Audrey said, you know, our problem necessarily isn't right in the heart of the loop, like it may be in Manhattan. It's sort of out on the expressways and some of the choke points north of downtown.
Yeah.
So we're going to hear more about this, I'm sure.
Justin.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for the revenue side, which I'm sure we'll get into. This is a classic example of something where you could say really are trying to change behavior. If you make it more difficult and more costly to come in during peak periods, that's what the behavior you would expect to see. And at least in the first couple of days of the experience in New York, that's exactly what seems to have happened. It's been amazing to watch a lot of the pictures, a lot of the experiences that people are having. They're seeing streets that used to be clogged, no longer clogged. So if you think of it as much an opportunity to change behavior as to generate revenue, you know, then I think it's an interesting conversation and one that has Joseph been happening all over the world.
And we'll talk more about that. But Joe, generally, who does congestion pricing impact? Is it just drivers? What about truck drivers and rideshare?
You know, it really is a behavioral set of incentives you want to have. We all know people that just hop in the car at a minute's notice without thinking about ways to drive a little more, you might say smartly, to carpool, to move those trips out of the busy period. So even little incentives, $1 or $2, can have a big effect on how people behave. And I think that's what we're seeing here. In New York, you know, there's discounts for taxi drivers and rideshare who, you know, they earn a living from those trips, and often those trips are combined with transit. And so you have to get it right. And exempting or giving discounts for low-income households is really important, too, because it can be a real shock. But it's a slippery slope. You start giving discounts for too many uses, and suddenly you undermine the whole intent.
Right.
So
and these folks that we mentioned, they're being charged extra as well. I mean, commercial trucks going into Manhattan below 60th Street, they're being charged between $3.60 and $21.60 per trip, depending on the truck size. And then New York City taxi riders are paying a new 75-cent surcharge per ride if they enter that zone, but it's $1.50 if you take Uber or Lyft. So
exactly. And the politics are fierce. And I think in Chicago, let's just say we have our share of politics here too. So if you create a cordon downtown, moving that a block or two, the aldermen are gonna hear it in a big way. But we have to get that discussion going.
Audrey, give us the pros and cons of a congestion tax.
Yeah, well, it does make people think twice about what they're doing using economic tools like pricing. So maybe they'll think about combining their trips. Maybe they'll think about shifting to cheaper modes of transportation like biking, walking, or transit if it's available. And just hopefully it would reduce the amount of driving. And driving has a ton of environmental impacts and safety impacts. And so that's really the goal here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Justin, the tolls, they're expected to make around $15 billion for the city's public transit system. What do you think about this way to generate revenue?
Yeah, I think there's trade-offs, as there is with any public policy solution and any new tax. I think the key that we've seen in places where this has worked is it has a couple key characteristics. One is that it's known in advance what we're going to do with the dollars. In the New York case, in the MTA case, in London, in Singapore, it's been used really for capital improvements. It's really been used to take transit systems and improve them and maintain them. And I think that's a really, really important part of it, is having some tangible benefit that comes from having these additional fees paid, as opposed to paying just to maintain the system and to deal with salaries of workers. And that's all important too, but this may or may not be the right tool to do that. So having dedicated capital funding stream, have this as a dedicated capital funding stream goes a long way. Second piece of it is transparency and predictability on what's going to happen with the rates. As Joe mentioned, the politics is fierce. The business community in particular is concerned about this. As you can imagine, a lot of the burden on this will fall on people delivering goods and small truckers and others that are paying a lot of those really high fees. They're not happy about that, but they're even less happy about the prospect of having to pay a congestion pricing toll that continues to increase and increase in ways that are unpredictable. If you give them something that they can plan for and respond to, they will. They won't be happy about it, but they will. But if it becomes a big question mark, then things become really difficult. And in that case, it becomes much less effective as a revenue tool.
So, Audrey, has congestion pricing actually been shown to lessen congestion?
Yes.
Does it actually work?
Yes, it does. There's great data in London. They've increased traffic speeds by 10 miles an hour and reduced traffic. So it definitely does work.
I wonder if that's going to work in New York. I'm a skeptic. Just folks that I know, they're like, they've taxed me, but I still have to get there. So I'm still going. And they know this, so they're going to win.
Yeah, and that's the criticism is, and to the point about the incidence, as we would say, who's actually paying it. It becomes then a question of who really has the choice and who doesn't. And some would argue that that's one of the potential drawbacks is not having the ability to decide means that the people, in some cases, who are least able to pay it are the ones who are going to end up paying it. But as was mentioned, you can tweak it, right? You can have exemptions, you can have credits, you can have lots of different ways to try to limit that impact on people who might otherwise be most affected by it.
Yeah. Well, to your point, Audrey, in a recent Chicago Tribune editorial, they write, quote, "New York is the first city in the country to adopt a policy otherwise more suited to European cities with clogged central business districts," end quote. I mean, so do you think that there's truth to that? Are American cities like Chicago maybe not suited for this?
Yeah, I think it's different. And I think we always need to look at policies in the context of the unique characteristics of where we want to do things. We don't want to cookie cutter them. And we want to look at the real situation in Chicago. And Chicago has very much of a regional transportation network and a regional transit system. And if you expand a cordon beyond a very tight core like they did in New York, you can theoretically have more people paying at a lower rate. So that could be a better outcome. The way we looked at it is, what if people paid $3 on a cordon along I-294 every time they came towards the city? So that's relatively low, but you could generate a ton of revenue to support transit. So that might be a better way to do it.
$3. Okay, so let's stay with that, Joe. Talk about how something like this could work in Chicago. What could it look like?
I think our region, as Audrey says, it's state and Jackson where we have the problem. It's sort of out there on the expressways and the North Lakefront. And you can envision, it's somewhat of a missed opportunity that we're rebuilding the Kennedy Expressway express lanes. And that could have been a great opportunity to, put our toe in the water and say, want to use those lanes, $1.50. Let us move up the learning curve, get that data to see how it works. And we have this tollway system, which is a magnificent system that's had tolls for a half a century. And we haven't again, tested things. How about high occupancy discounts if you got 3 people in the car, or if you're driving at 2 in the morning, you're going to pay less than if it's in rush hour. So I think getting in the game here to do this incrementally as opposed to sort of one size fits all solution. And we're feeling it. I mean, you travel, traffic is up since before the pandemic.
It is.
We had the misconception that rush hour driving was going to be a little easier because people are working at home. I see you're nodding. That
It's not.
and
It's
so
not.
it's back, and it's unfortunately only going to get worse.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, Justin, but I'm curious if this could mean more costs for businesses. So, deliveries or rideshare, for instance, and whether maybe that's something that gets passed on to consumers.
That's definitely what the business community will tell you. They'll say that if you do this, business has no choice but to pass it on to consumers, and then we all pay for it in the form of higher prices, in the form of, in some cases, certain goods and certain services that may not even be delivered downtown. I know one of the concerns the business community has said is that, to the point earlier about kind of the unevenness of the nature of the problem, that there's large parts of downtown that need people in any way you can get them to come downtown, parts of the South Loop in particular. And so if you make things more difficult and expensive and you make it, if you increase the prices of doing business down there, which many would agree, that's exactly what happens when you do congestion pricing, that's kind of going against what we're trying to do with downtown more generally. And so I think, that's definitely the argument that the business community makes. And I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that we've seen in other places that this has been done, that happens to a degree. But again, like with any new tax or fee, it's all in how you design it. It's all in how you provide different types of credits and exemptions and deductions and different rates. And all that can be done, I think, in a way that might, if you really intend on doing it, sort of tailor it to the uniquely Chicago circumstances.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. Is charging a congestion tax on drivers the answer to Chicago's traffic and budget woes? Well, we are discussing with a panel of transportation experts. We've got Audrey Wennink, who's the Director of Transportation with the Metropolitan Planning Council. Justin Marlowe, who's a research professor in the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. And Joe Schwieterman, who's director of the Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development at DePaul University. So there's been a lot of people I'm hearing, from Chicagoans, non-Chicagoans alike. They've voiced their concerns about this. We definitely have heard some thoughts from New Yorkers so far. I'm curious, who actually supports this locally? Joe?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think one challenge that we have is that, let's just say, public trust in our government isn't where it needs to be. And a lot of skepticism, this could become a money grab. And of course, our deficits and debt is so great that there's a real risk of that we look at this to shore up the budget. And our experience with red light cameras hasn't been particularly good with some of the malfeasance we've had with that. So you got to sell the public that this is going to be done smartly. And it really is going to be intended to reduce congestion and not fill those city budget gaps. And that puts us at a bit of a disadvantage.
Curious about your opinions around the table. In support, Audrey?
Yeah, MCC is very much in support. As I said, we have been looking at a concept where it's regional and maybe along the I-294 cordon. But I think you really need to think about what you're going to do with the money and get people excited about it. So, for example, Pulse runs buses on the expressway on I-55. So what if you were able to take the revenue and run tons more buses so that people could, instead of paying a $3 cordon fee, they put the transit fare and they have a very predictable transit ride. So if we offer a lot more transit service at the same time using the money that we're collecting, people could really see tangible benefits, and you could do that rather quickly. With operations funding, you just add buses. You don't need to really build so much right away. And so I think that's what we need to get people excited about what they're going to get out of it.
Yeah. What do you think, Justin? Yay or nay for this idea for Chicago?
Yeah, I think the key point, just to reiterate, you don't do this as a revenue grab. That's going to backfire very quickly. You do this to reduce congestion. You do this to improve air quality. You do this to...
So you're saying lead with that?
Lead with that. And again, I think a lot of the opposition to this, particularly from the business community, nobody's against less congestion. Nobody's against cleaner air. It just comes down to how you design it. It comes down to who ultimately pays it. And again, having those tangible benefits, especially if you're talking about investing in the transit system and making it work more effectively, making it move more effectively. all those trade-offs, I think, can be really palatable. It just comes down to why you're doing it and how it's led in the first place.
And though we don't want to lead with the money per se, I mean, so it's clear, how much revenue could something like this bring into Chicago?
Yeah, well, the most recent, I think, credible estimates that have been, and the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning has looked at this, and some others as of late, as part of the discussion about the transit funding gap that was mentioned earlier. Depending on how you would do it, the number I think to put out there, just to kind of anchor on, would be $1 billion. Some have said that if you were to have a New York style or a London style congestion pricing cordon in downtown Chicago, it would be about $1 billion. And you would have the kind of rates that we see in New York and London, those $40, $45 for light trucks, $9 to $14 for individual cars. So that's a lot of money, to be clear. At the same time, that's actually, though, about as much as the transit funding gap that we currently have. And so it creates a big question about what's the value add? And if this just becomes a way to backfill a gap that we know was already there, then again, I think politically it becomes very difficult. And economically, it no longer makes sense in quite the same way as it does, again, if you do this as a way to mitigate congestion, improve quality of life for people in the region.
I love that Audrey says, make it about something that people can get excited about. So I think about whether the money generated in a city like ours could address those ongoing problems that we hear people talk about all the time with the city's transit system. Like, could we potentially have no more ghost buses, Joe?
Yeah, and just...
Because that excites me.
It does excite me, too. And just drive on I-290 at rush hour outbound during the day, or Kennedy Expressway to O'Hare, sitting in a taxi cab, and you'll see the status quo just isn't acceptable. I mean, it's just a harrowingly long trip with all the congestion. So I think you look, both of those routes have transit that can be upgraded. There's talk about a shuttle from downtown to O'Hare. All those things, can be part of the mix if you think creatively about changing the way people use and experience transit.
Yeah. So theoretically, Audrey, if it gets to a point where we have fewer drivers on the road, would a tax be necessary?
Well, you'd have to implement the tax to get to that point. So, right, the tax both raises revenue and changes behavior. So that's the point. And then you just need to invest that tax in the transit to deliver the benefit. And you want to do that at the same time, ideally. You don't want to say, oh, we're going to do this tax for 10 years and then you're going to get something. You want to be able to deliver something relatively quickly so people see that benefit and then they accept it. And that's what's happened in other regions in the world.
Yeah. So the big question, and I'm going to go around the table. I want direct responses from each of you. Should Chicago follow suit? And I'm talking, of course, about New York. Justin?
It depends.
Oh, not the it depends
that's
response.
the best I can give you. It depends on how it would be designed. There are definitely situations where you could, as I think we've established here, do something like this that would be uniquely tailored to Chicago's circumstances. It probably involves tolling on the freeways. It probably involves a very different model than a cordon, the way New York or London has done it. But I think, the idea that you could change behavior by making it more expensive to drive into downtown through any number of different channels is something that could potentially have some value in.
All right, I'll take your it depends. Joe?
I do support it, and I think it's more of a expressway-driven system, less about driving into the loop. I think also recognize we're not New York, so the fees would have to be lower here. The cost
Much
of living
lower.
is lower. And you need to reassure the public that we're not just going to do what New York did, because we're a different animal here.
Yeah. Should Chicago do this, Audrey?
Yes, the Chicago region should do this. So this should be we should absolutely look at this, but think about it more holistically in terms of regional revenue generation and regional transit.
We'll leave it there. Audrey Wennink is the Director of Transportation with the Metropolitan Planning Council. Justin Marlowe is the research professor in the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. And Joe Schwieterman is Director of the Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development at DePaul University. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.